The classic book, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, begins with this really popular line. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. In previous interviews, when you've described your childhood and your teenage years, I think this line fits it perfectly. You grew up in post-World War II London in the 1950s, which was a rather grim decade. You've mentioned in previous interviews that you used to explore bomb sites with your friends. Rationing was the norm of the time. But as it so often happens in periods of unrest and tragedy, it's also a cultural explosion. I personally feel the 50s and 60s and 70s in the UK were probably one of the most rich and productive eras of British culture. The explosion that you saw in the music, arts, and literature, maybe in architecture, movies, was pretty incredible. You have said in a previous interview that it was the decades of youth rebellion, rock music, the pill, rejection of old-fashioned values, the anti-establishment counterculture, the hippie movement. Such an explosion. It was the decades of the Beatles, Cream, Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stone, Monty Python, Glastonbury. The seeds were starting to get planted for the Manchester phenomenon or the punk movement. It was also a period of great political unrest with lots of strikes and unions that led to the rise of Margaret Thatcher. And you have lived through all of this. So can you do me the favor and take me back to your childhood and your teenage years? What was it like growing up in London, in the UK, in the 50s and 60s and 70s? Let's get inside a time capsule. What are some memories that stand out to you? Can you paint the picture for me?
Yeah, so you've done your homework, I see. Look, the times were hard in some ways, they were great in others, as you've pointed out. The times weren't terribly hard for me. The times were hard for my parents because their generation had lived through 2 world wars, a depression. Their life was much tougher than mine has ever been. Okay, and my father came back from the army, where he fought in the Second World War, married my mother. We lived in a working class suburb of South London. My father was a manual labourer. My mother was a homemaker. But they did experience rationing. It didn't affect me because I was a kid. Okay, so they had a hard time. My life was much easier than theirs, as I've explained. And a feature of the time is this. There was a post-war Labour government led by Clement Attlee, and they were one of the most radical governments that the UK ever had. So they produced the national health system. They created a national power grid. They nationalised the railways. They made it possible for working class kids like me to go to university. They paid their fees, their college fees, gave them a subsistence allowance. So a working class kid like me could never have gone to university 20 years before. But they made it possible, the changes that the working class, the Labour government made. Okay, so it was also a time of economic expansion because of the post-war boom. And that changed the climate of the place. I mean, Britain and Europe in the 40s and 30s have been had suffered from the Depression and the war and so on, whereas this was now all behind us. And the quality of living was rising, the opportunities for working class kids were rising. And as you pointed out, this changed an enormous change in the social mores. Good in many ways, it had some downsides, but it was very exciting to live through. So although I was a working class kid, there was an institution called the grammar school, which kids sat an exam at their primary school at the age of 11.
11 plus.
11 plus.
Yeah.
And the ones who did well enough were taken to a grammar school, which gave them a relatively academic education.
Yep.
I was fortunate. I got creamed off. And I decided I wanted to go to university. So I applied to university and was fortunate to get into Cambridge. My mother was, over the moon. My father was not so pleased, but that's another story. And at school, I fell in love with mathematics. So I went to study mathematics at Cambridge. And over the course of that, I discovered that actually I was more interested in philosophy. So I carried on with mathematics. My doctorate's actually in mathematics as well, although it's in mathematical logic. But by the time I finished, I knew two things. First, philosophy was a lot more fun than mathematics. And secondly, I would only ever be a very mediocre mathematician. So I wanted a job in the philosophy department. And the first job I was ever offered was a temporary job at the University of St Andrews. It was in philosophy. I don't know. I have no idea why they offered it to me with my background, but I'm delighted they did. So I got a job in philosophy, and that's where I've been ever since.